Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this dialogue on the role of universities in working with communities to achieve change. Thank you all for coming. My name is Margot Fryer. I'm the director of the UBC Learning Exchange. We're honored to have everyone here this morning, along with some very eminent and wonderful speakers, including John McKnight from Northwestern University in Chicago, who many of you know. As well, we have Chris Kelly, Janet Austin, and Saachi Vikram Singh. I thought I would start this morning with giving you a bit of context for the dialogue, but before I get into that, if I can ask if anybody's got cell phones, pagers, beepers, Twitters, all those things, if you can please turn those off, that would be great. I'll mention too that we are recording the speakers for this event so that we can have the information available as a webcast or whatever the right terminology is. You can tell I'm not a technical person, so but we are recording the event. So for the format for the event, I will give a bit of context to the dialogue, and then John will speak for half an hour. Then each panelist will comment on John's remarks. Each panelist will have 10 minutes. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for you to speak with each other, get a sense of your perspectives and what you think about what you've heard from the speakers. And then there will be time for questions and answers for you to ask any of the panelists questions that you might have. So in terms of giving some context for the dialogue, many of you know that various parts of UBC have been engaging in various communities for a long time. Those of you who are aware of the strategic planning processes that are going on in the university will know that the latest version of UBC's strategic plan and vision is called Place and Promise. And it states a very strong commitment to engage with communities in what are described as mutually beneficial relationships that enhance economic, social, and cultural well-being. This plan commits UBC to increasing student participation in community service learning, community-based research, and other parts of service in the community. And as someone who's been working for the past 10 years to try to form relationships between the university and the community, specifically in our case the downtown east side and other inner city communities, I can tell you that I'm really thrilled to see this level of commitment to engaging with communities on the part of the university. This is part of a much wider trend in the post-secondary sector, both in Canada, the United States, and other parts of the world, where universities are trying to engage more strongly in social, economic, ecological issues and make a difference in the issues that are facing the world. This is happening for a number of reasons, including the fact that we see very powerful outcomes from the work that occurs when universities and communities work together. We know from our own experience here at UBC that when university students get involved, for example, in elementary schools as literacy tutors, sports coaches, leaders of science or math activities, special projects during reading week, or otherwise play roles as mentors and role models for students in schools, everyone benefits. The kids in the schools get more excited about learning, they have their own horizons broadened. The UBC students learn about social issues in a whole different way from directly engaging with kids. Teachers benefit because they've got some extra help in the classroom, and the whole school environment often benefits. For example, in Reading Week, sometimes we have entire schools that stop their regular activities and get involved with UBC students doing special projects. We also know that when students get involved in nonprofit organizations, there's some amazing work that happens there as well. Students help agencies deliver the programs that are already in existence as well. Students often help organizations to develop new programs that the organization otherwise wouldn't be able to create because they don't have the resources. Also, students increasingly now are getting engaged in community-based research that allows organizations to make better decisions, to plan more effectively for the future. But I'm aware that this kind of commitment on the part of the university also involves challenges and risks. Many of us who work in this area talk about the need for change in society. On one level, this is a pretty straightforward assertion. I think we can all agree that there are serious social, economic, and environmental changes or issues facing society, and there really needs to be some change happening. The status quo is not okay. But once we start taking action to achieve change, we run into all kinds of complex questions. What kinds of changes in what areas do we think are needed most? Who decides what is a desirable change? Who should we be working with as a university? And for those of us who are engaging in this kind of activity, what's our theory of change? And by this I mean, how do we think change occurs in communities? How do we think social issues get resolved? What really are we trying to achieve when we engage in this kind of activity? And what forces do we need to be aware of in society that might help or hinder the change effort? And what possible unintended consequences of our efforts might occur? And perhaps most importantly, we need to be asking the question, how does the power and status that the university carries as a publicly funded state institution affect decisions about the kinds of activities we engage in, the community partners we work with, and the goals we pursue? What are the possibilities and the limits of what we can legitimately do as a university working collaboratively with communities? These are the kinds of questions that I'm hoping we will explore this morning with our speakers and with each other. The aim is to explore these issues, not to try to find definitive answers, but rather to expand the dialogue about these kinds of issues. And our first speaker is uniquely qualified to get us started in this dialogue. John McKnight, as I mentioned, is a professor at Northwestern University and the co-director of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. He's author of a book called The Careless Society, Community and Its Counterfeits, which is a book I highly recommend if you haven't read it. Throughout John's long and distinguished career, he's been challenging the status quo. For example, his arguments about focusing on the assets, gifts, and strengths in communities rather than their deficits, needs, and problems has resulted in a worldwide movement for asset-based community development. He's done a lot of consulting and advising in many communities here in BC and elsewhere in Canada. John has been a source of inspiration for me personally since I was first introduced to his work almost 20 years ago. Please join me in welcoming John McKnight.
Thank you, Mark. Well, good morning. How are you? Can you hear me? All right, good. I'm very happy to be here because it feels like I'm home. You can't imagine how much time a person from Chicago could have spent in Vancouver and in British Columbia. I made a little note last night, and it's not very comprehensive, but I work at a research center at the university that focuses on what are the determinants of success for local communities. And as a result of that, it allows us to travel all over North America especially and look at small communities. And I have done that kind of research in Powell River and Prince George, where I have been 24 times over 2 years. In Kelowna, Enderby, Sussex, Queen Charlotte Island, Kitimat, and all the towns down the Skeena River Valley, and Radium Hot Springs, and Vancouver and its neighborhoods a fair number of times. So it literally is like coming home. And I have learned a lot and then tried to share what we have learned by looking at the determinants of successful local communities. I think what I have learned from coming so often to British Columbia and Canada in general is that Canada is what the United States would be like if the United States were a reasonable place. It is a place where it seems to me people have much more conviction that they have the capacity when they come together in a joint effort to really change things. That's the threshold issue, incidentally, for community change. Do you believe you could change things? And I think living in a country that has 10 times more people, that one of the things that happens is you begin to lose some faith because of the scale that you can really change things. So one of the things I've learned a lot about is that I can go to Kitimat and sit down with 20 people and talk with them about the future, and that they can come up with ideas that they believe they could actually make come true. And so I think that's the biggest difference between the two countries, is the belief on the part of most people that working together, you really can change things. And it's that change that I've been most interested in. As we have looked at over 3,000 different local communities over the years, I mean very local, not Vancouver, I mean a downtown east side scale place. It seemed to us that if you wanted to understand what are the building blocks, what are the resources that people use in a local community that also determines whether or not the place will be successful for its residents, that there are three basic resources. We call them assets. And I made a little asset map of these three. I have another book which says there are 5, but I'm just going to talk about 3 today because they're the most important. And this is the map. And the 3 basic building blocks or resources or determinants of success at the local level is, first of all, in the middle, the residents themselves. But the residents viewed in terms of their gifts, capacities, and skills, and not their problems, deficits, and needs. You can't do anything with a need. I have a bad heart. Nobody needs it in my neighborhood, but it is a need. So one of the most significant things looking at local communities and the ability of change to take place there is that the focus is not on needs. Needs surveys collect information about which information that cannot be used. What can be used are the assets, and the primary asset is the residents and their gifts, the first on the map. The second asset on the map is the local groups, organizations, clubs, and what I think are technically called associations, smaller face-to-face groups of people at the local level, and they are not paid. So they might include groups such as women's groups, block clubs, athletic associations, artistic groups, faith-based organizations, neighborhood organizations, environmental associations, associations of seniors, organizations at the local level for all kinds of reform, on and on and on and on. If you want to see one of the most comprehensive studies ever done of the associations in a community, go to the internet and look up Prince George and type in Project Friendship. And this is an organization, Prince George, that has identified, I think, every single association in that community. Several thousand, running from ski clubs to jugglers associations. It's amazing. If you have any kind of interest, there's an association in Prince George, a place of 80,000 people. So that's the second resource, and those are the little circles. Now, associations are very important because they are the way the gifts and the capacities of residents are connected, mobilized, and expressed. They are the loudspeakers or amplifiers of resident capacities. And they are the principal producers, based on the research we've done, of community change, certainly the fountainhead of that change. The third local resource or building block is the local institutions, and they come in three kinds: the for-profit, the businesses. You can see I have them as triangles, right? And these are the businesses. Then there are the not-for-profit organizations and the government groups, of which a university here would be one, right? So these institutions differ in one critical way from associations, and that is the people in them are paid to do what they do. People in associations are not paid to do what they do. If you notice on the map, there are two colors. There's the red part, and there's the black part. The black part is the institutional part. We know them. But the red part, I think, is less familiar, but it is nonetheless, it has a name. It's civil society. It's the place where social capital is generated. I would call it the citizen sector, but it is the heart of democracy. Because after all, institutions don't create democracies. Citizens do. There were societies with great institutions called Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But what they didn't have is a red center. There was no freedom of expression for individuals and no right to association. So our research suggests that the most important thing to understand about a locality is it is a resource base, and it has three basic resources, and two of them make up civil society, and the other sector is the institutional sector. Now, we think that one way of thinking about what makes a successful local community is to understand that the critical issue is the balances of authority and responsibility between the institutions and the civil society, or I am going to say the community or citizen sector. What are the balances? I have a colleague, Jody Kretzmann, who I've worked with for years, and he says the real issue is, are they co-producers? But in fact, the most common thing that we have found is that they aren't co-producers. And the critical issue is, how do they become co-producers? What I think we traditionally I'm going to say the last 50 years at least, have come to believe is that the red space will be good if the black triangles do their job. If the institutions do things efficiently and justly, then the community will be a good place to live. And there is some truth to that, and we have dedicated a huge amount of effort in Western society to make that come true through all kinds of institutional reforms. And I think what we now know as we enter the 21st century is the limits of what institutions can do at their best. That no matter how much technology, no matter how much management consulting, no matter how many efficiency experts, there is a limit to the productivity of the triangles. And in a way, the problem of Western society, especially in urban areas, could be understood as too much triangle and too little red space in terms of power, authority, and productivity. I think one way of understanding that is to think about institutions and communities as two tools, like a hammer and a saw, right? Each is good but they do different things. And the more we have looked at these local communities and the institutions that surround them, the more it has become clear to us that the limits of institutions are clearest in 7 areas. And it is in these 7 areas that the domain of community is critical. And if the community is not organized and effective on its part, no matter what the institutions do, things won't work. So let me remind you quickly. How much time have I taken up?
You're good.
I'm good. Well, you don't know.
20.
Oh, good. Okay. So, as we have looked over and over at local places and their relationship with the institutions, it seems to us that it is these 7 areas where local communities have the major possibility for achieving change. Or put the other way, where institutions have the least likelihood of being able to make change as the principal actor. So let me go over these with you. This is the domain of the red space. This is what civil society has as its primary function. And if it doesn't perform that function, it won't get done. But there will be all kinds of dislocations and things called problems that institutions will focus on and try to deal with. But those will never deal with the absence of the capacity of the local community to perform its function. It'll only try to compensate for the failure of that performance. So let me remind you of what is the domain of civil society, of a local community. The first is health. Every epidemiologist will tell you, although they debate a little, that your health, at least measured by how long you live and how often you'll be sick, right? That your health is going to be determined by access to medicine at most 9 to 10% of your health can be accounted for by medicine. That 90% has to do with what happens in the space of civil society, in the activity, in the individual's behavior, in social relationships, in the nature of the physical environment, and in economic status, none of which are medical issues. So, health policy that focuses on medical reform is a decision not to do much about health, right? Because if you knew 90% of your health was not determined by medicine, and your whole focus, as in the United States, right, is on medicine. We're not talking about health care reform or health. We're talking about medicine, right? So health is a major space filled, if it will be filled, by civil society, its activities and organizations. The second is safety. All kinds of neighborhood research now indicate that the 2 major determinants of security and safety is how many neighbors do you know by name and how much time do you spend in public space. Amazing, right? That is the life of relationships and common activities, the major predictor of safety. The third is the economy. In Western societies, a majority of all jobs are still produced by small businesses. And the locality of red space is the location of a majority of small businesses. And the probability of their success is much determined by what happens in the locality. So if one were really concerned about jobs, one would be focused on neighborhoods. Right? And if one were really concerned about jobs, one would also focus on neighborhoods for a second reason. In North America, the majority of people still get their jobs by word of mouth. And that word of mouth is bounded largely by neighbors, friends, and relatives at the local level. So for both the generation of jobs internally and the identification of jobs externally, local communities are key factors. Next one is environment. I think this is becoming clearer and clearer to each of us individually. The climate change problem finally comes down to John McKnight and his decisions about how he's going to transport himself. His decisions about how he's going to heat himself, right? His decisions about how he's going to provide light. His decisions about how much waste he chooses to generate. So at the local level, the critical questions about environment are fashioned every day by the culture. Somebody said to me, in my neighborhood, if you don't cut your grass, everybody begins to put pressure on you. If you throw out in your waste cans 5 tons of stuff a year, nobody cares. Supposing having waste piling up in the alley was culturally as important locally as whether we cut our grass, right? And which is more important? So environment is a critically fashioned reality in terms of locality. Next one is food. We're learning very quickly that the local production of food is critical for health, economy, and environment. I have rarely seen a movement grow so fast. Do you see that here? As the local food movement? Why? Because it gets to economy, it gets to health, and it gets to environment by one particular focus, right? I just got somebody sent me an organization called Yard Sharing. You might look at it on the internet, in which there's a movement in neighborhoods to get people to share their yards for the production of food, right? And so it's going to be very interesting to see as we begin to rethink where food comes from. The next one is children. The major determinant, I think, of child well-being is a village. How many people here say it takes a village to raise a child? Everybody believes that. We have yet to find hardly any villages that raise a child. What we find is neighborhoods that pay people called teachers, coaches, counselors, recreation and parks people, doctors, nurses, parole officers, and probation officers to raise their children. And the amount of community raising in a village is very small. So we have a wonderful opportunity to reconstruct our behavior around our words if we really wanted to have children who would be productive for the future. And the last is care. Care is the freely given commitment of one person to the other from the heart. I care for her. More than anybody in the world, I will care for my father till the day he dies. I care so much about this neighborhood. I'd never move away. I care. And what the triangles, the institutions, can't do is provide care. They can provide service. This university can't care, it can educate. Maybe a professor could care, but that's up to the professor. On the other hand, the community and its associations have only care because there is no money. Every association is the best sign where you live of what people care about. They are there because they care about each other or they care about the same thing. An institution, on the other hand, is a group of people who are there, I think, because they're paid. They may have some common interests, but the day the president of my university stops paying us, our grand community of scholars will disappear. Right? So where is care? Care is the red space. It's powered by care. If you're concerned about care, care for yourself, for your mother, for your children. It is the space where the relationships will determine whether or not care is possible. So those are, I think, the 7 domains of local community. And if they don't do it, it won't get done. How much time do I have left? 9 minutes. So now let's go to the institutions, and let's just pick one, the university. And let's think about how the map works if we're thinking about one institution, a university. How does a university become the co-producer in this relationship with civil society and the local community and its roles? I am going to speak here from the experience of 35 years of being at a university, but doing research about small communities. And over that time, it seems to be there are some principles that have appeared to me to be important. So let me just suggest what some of the principles for a co-productive relationship between universities and local communities might be. The first one comes from a book that we commissioned by the city manager of Savannah, Georgia, who wrote a book called Leading by Stepping Back. And he said, the first thing I learned, not the first thing, the last thing I learned after many failures, was that we had figured out how to intervene in local neighborhoods, but never how to support them to do what only they can do. And so he developed a series of city policies that began by saying, what we are going to do for our leadership role is to step back, to ask, where are we replacing, controlling, overwhelming the power of citizens to be producers? Right? The second is, now let's listen. Let's listen to what people in the red space think. What they think they can do. What they think would be helpful from the outside. Let's listen. Now, one of the dilemmas of listening is that you might not care for what you'd hear. And let me give you an example. I remember one time some doctors from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, came to visit us, and they said, you know a lot about local communities. Can you give us a hand? Most cities have passed laws outlawing smoking in every place but bars. The bars are organized, and they've stopped the bars from being covered by the law. So we'd like to get some ideas of how we could get local communities interested in doing something about the bars. And we know that they're citadels of smoking, and they produce more heart disease and cancer and lots of charts and that stuff. And so we didn't have the foggiest idea, of course, about what you would do about that. So that night I was going to a neighborhood organization meeting. This is an organization made up of block clubs and local churches. And I said, why don't you come along? And he came along. And I got him on the agenda at the end. And when he went forward and showed his charts and said, can you help us? Because I think that smoking is the most perilous, death-creating thing that's here. What can we do? How could we get neighborhood groups to begin to focus on these bars? And there was a big silence. And then finally the chair lady, whose name was Elizabeth Snodgrass, I'll never forget her, she said, I want to apologize, I don't think we have any ideas for you. She said, did you hear the prayer at the beginning of our meeting? And he said, yes. She said, we prayed for 2 young people, a girl 17 and a boy 18, who were shot this weekend as a result of the gang warfare. We probably think that's our health problem. Can you help us with that? And he couldn't. Right? So when one listens and begins to see what the priorities are, it might begin to reshape the resources that one would think are important, even within your own institution. Okay? The corollary of this is very hard. Don't be a program pusher. Be a listener and a supporter of civil society. In Chicago, I ran into a man years ago who said to me, I was in the neighborhood, and I said, what do you think we should do, university? And he said, don't do nothing nobody wants. And a lot of program pushing is doing something nobody wants. May be important, may be right, but may not be wanted. I think programs follow listening. A fourth principle is, what do local people want to know that you actually could find out? And how would you organize yourselves to find that out? In Toronto, a couple of years ago, there were some of the lower income neighborhoods became so disgusted with the way the 2 big newspapers reported their neighborhoods compared to all the other neighborhoods. They said, in our neighborhoods, you'd think people only kill each other and use drugs. In the other neighborhoods, they do wonderful things. Right? And so they got York University to do a wonderful study, right, of comparison of how the papers reported neighborhoods. And it was so powerful that then the 3 neighborhood organizations could take it and engage in serious negotiation about coverage, the discriminatory coverage of the Toronto newspapers of local neighborhoods. So now you can find that on our website. Fifth is, often universities can be very helpful in convening local people around innovation. Not introducing it, but convening about it. And sixth, and I could go on 7, 8, 9, 10 at a time, but let's say something about students that is, I think, a difficult thing, because every university in North America now is getting students out into the community. I would like people who are students, when they go to neighborhoods, to go to a neighborhood like this. The necessities are here. They're inexpensive and they're close. Services are available. You can volunteer and participate. You can feel connected to a community's heritage. There are green spaces that connect us to nature and the spirit. Here you can feel accepted. Here people have empathy. Here lots of people work for social justice. Here the sense of community is strong. That's the community, I think, our students need to see. Right? Those are the findings of a study done by an organization called CCAP, which stands for Carnegie Community Action Project. And it's a description of their findings regarding the downtown Lower East Side. Right? That's what they found in talking to 200 residents about the downtown Lower East Side. Now, if I place a student there in a setting where all they see is that aspect of people that is problematic and broken, how will they ever see the community that the residents report? And I think that's the greatest dilemma of all. How is it that we can connect students to the red space, to the productive space, to the spaces that you ought to look at, to the space the residents see? Because often when we place our students in our not-for-profits, what we're doing is saying to them, we want you to look at the broken part, and we'll let you see people in their brokenness day after day after day. What is the pedagogy? What is our purpose? So those are at least some thoughts on how we get the relationships in a good order, and also reminds us that we are a service institution, a university, right? We provide educational service. We are a service to the community. A servant is not a lord. A servant listens and responds. And so the map says, if we're a triangle, the question is, how do we be a servant and support, right, civil society? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I'm not going to comment at all on John's remarks, but I'm going to ask our panelists to do that, starting with Janet Austin, who's the CEO of the YWCA here in Vancouver, an organization that does amazing work with and on behalf of children and kids. And Janet is uniquely qualified to comment on this issue, partly too because she's been involved for many years here at the university on various advisory committees and so on, and has been involved in discussions about UBC's role in the community.
Margot, thank you so much, and thank you, John, for an absolutely fascinating presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I think hopefully in my 10 minutes I'll have an opportunity to reflect on my views on some of the points you've made and my experience in dealing with some of the challenges that you've laid out. So I think what I want to do with my 10 minutes here is hopefully give you a bit of a practical perspective based on my experience, both as a professional and as a community volunteer with a wide range of organizations, and through my experience with Margot's work in the Learning Exchange, and I guess UBC more broadly. And what I would like to do, I think, is start with UBC's vision and mission statement, because that's what the university says it's all about, it's going to do, it's going to be. And I've been privileged over the years to participate in a number of discussions about the evolution of that mission and vision statement. And going back, I think, Chris, you may have been part of this as well, but going back a number of years, when Martha Piper was your president, we had a big discussion about Trek 2010. And I was part of a think tank that looked at how that should be framed. And there was quite a passionate debate about whether words like citizenship should even be included. And there was a very strong, I guess, cohort of participants who felt that it's about learning and it's about research, period. And doing anything more diffuses the role of the university. Well, given my role and my experience, of course, I feel inspired by this idea of creating global citizenship and the university playing a role in convening dialogue to help us deal with some of the really challenging and what we often feel are intractable challenges in society. So I want to start just by giving you a few words from the vision and mission statement, which I think are pertinent. So, prepare students to become exceptional global citizens, and the word is citizens. Promote the values of a civil and sustainable society. Conduct outstanding research to serve the people of British Columbia, Canada, and the world. Be an agent for positive change through cooperating with government, business, industry, and the professions, as well as educational institutions and the community, to discover, disseminate, and I think this is really important, apply new research, new knowledge, improve the quality of life, okay? So that is language which sets a very clear path, which is different from just defining the role as learning and research. So I want to approach this question today of the role of the university from three perspectives. First of all, how can the university relate to the community at the front line, at the institutional level, and at the societal level? So in terms of the front line, we have a really, I think, outstanding example of positive engagement with the community through Margot Fryer's leadership and the work of the Learning Exchange. And the Learning Exchange has worked extensively with the YWCA ever since its inception, going back to 1999, where we first began to work on issues around the Downtown East Side. Our organization has had a very strong focus in the Downtown East Side for more than 30 years. And we've had a particular focus on dealing with the issues of women and children in that community. So I want to, I guess, put my comments through the lens of that work in the Downtown East Side. Some of you may be aware that we operate a facility there called Crabtree Corner, and as I said, it works with highly marginalized women and children. But our model of service there, and I think it's important to share this with you, our model of service is really based on, it comes from a position of respect, which means that we need to recognize and embrace that people will make changes if and when they're ready, and we need to respect wherever they are in that personal journey. So in a sense, it's being without judgment, right? Being without judgment, though, isn't the same thing, in my opinion, as being without expectations. Because I think when I look at the way that organization, that facility, or that community within the YWCA functions, I believe that a large reason why we have been successful, and I believe we've been extraordinarily successful, is because of our holistic approach, which is not about saying, okay, well, you need housing or you need childcare or whatever. It's about saying, what do you want? You know, how do you see your future unfolding? And then how do we, as an agent of supporting that, connect you with or help you get the supports, the services that you need to make that journey successfully. So when I think about our work in that Downtown East Side, one of the things I am most proud of is our staff. And this is not just the Downtown East Side, but it's really throughout our organization. Because throughout our organization, in the various programs that we operate, we see many women and men who have actually initially come to us as participants in our program. They have overcome the challenges that they've needed to face. They've perhaps started as volunteers, they've been supported to develop some education, and now they are our employees. So when you look at our work at Crabtree Corner, most of our staff actually are women who have come successfully through our programs. They lack formal education. I think they may, for the most part, have achieved a grade 9. But they have a credibility in that context that I could never have because they have lived that experience, and they are outstanding role models for the women who come in off the street. They see themselves reflected, they see their experience reflected, and they see that it is possible to chart a different future for themselves. So I'm going to give you just one cute story, which I sometimes tell. It's, we actually had an event at Crabtree Corner last night, and we had a number of our staff and volunteers speak about their experience. And one of them is a woman named Gladys Evoy. She runs our FASD programs now, and she's just a total spark. She was the child of a residential school situation. Her father was a teacher, her mother was a student. She was born when her mother was a teenager. Abusive family relationship, there was violence, there was alcohol abuse. So she left home at about the age of 12. She lived on the street, survived in the sex trade, was addicted to crack cocaine and alcohol, and had a number of children who were affected with FASD. Well, at some point, she recognized that if she did not make some changes, she wasn't really going to live much longer. So she had a watershed moment, and she did go into detox, and in her words, got clean. And after a period of time, she connected. She had previously been a participant in our programs, but she connected with our fetal alcohol spectrum disorder program and went through that. Worked as a volunteer, got her alcohol and drug counseling certification, became an outreach worker, and now she's running these programs. And anyway, she's just very honest about sharing her experience, and so she does speak about it quite often in the community. And I had one of the ministers of the provincial government actually hear her speak and say, you know, we need to have this perspective shared, you know, among senior officials. So can she come? So we sent her to Victoria. I don't think she'd ever been in a plane. She goes over there in the helijet, she's picked up, she's driven to the legislature, and she gives an outstanding presentation. The minister phones me afterwards and says, totally pumped, right? Because she did it so well. But said, you know, Janet, you know what she said? She said, the way you communicate with Aboriginal women is simple. It's just tell women they're worth it. That's all you have to do. Just tell them they're worth it. So anyway, the next day Gladys comes back and I see her and I ask her how it goes, and she says to me, puts her hands on her hips and she says, well, Janet, from prostitution to parliament. No, she really said that. I'm not making this up. But I wanted to share that story because I think it shows the culture within our organization and the way we, in all our programs, attempt to work. And I want to comment about the really important role that Margot's team, many students like Saachi have played in our organization, and the work in the downtown east side is one example. We've been privileged to engage students from all faculties, you know, engineering, nutrition, environmental science, education, throughout our programs, and we've absorbed, I believe, more than the lion's share of the capacity that you have to place students in the community. So it is an outstanding example of the university connecting effectively at the front line. Okay, there's lots more I could say about that. I also want to comment about the university's role at a societal level, and again, an example from my personal experience. So I've been privileged to work with the Human Early Learning Partnership, which is an interdisciplinary group here at UBC, colleagues of Margot's, for a number of years around the big question of how we address vulnerability, the very unconscionably high rate of vulnerability in children, in our community, in our society. How do we deal with that? So, interestingly, HELP's mandate is to advance, again, apply research in an interdisciplinary way to help children thrive. Now, this is not a simple topic. I mean, there's questions of brain science, there's questions of early learning, nutrition, also societal values around the role of women at home and in the workplace, you know, that whole values discussion, and big implications for public policy. Now, one of the things that we've discussed, and I work very closely with Clyde and his team, one of the things we've talked a lot about is how our society, there's no time. There's a lack of time for parents to deal effectively with their children. There's a lack, 2 minutes left, gosh, I've got so much more to say. So how do we deal with that? And part of the question there is how we actually deal with that lack of space. And that really, in my opinion, requires a public policy response. okay? However, when you look at the way the university institution is set up, I participated as an external reviewer on someone's application for tenure and promotion quite recently, and actually went to the trouble to look at how the university recognizes and penalizes faculty. There is nothing in that that recognizes knowledge translation off campus or that recognizes the importance of an interdisciplinary approach. Now, these are complex questions. They require complex solutions. And I think that multidisciplinary approach is really fundamental. I've got more things to say, but I am going to conclude just by giving you one more example. I was privileged to participate a couple of years ago in a delegation put together by Van City, which is the largest credit union in Canada. And it was a group of very diverse leaders. We had leading labor leaders, we had business leaders, we had me, they called me the social economy. And we went to Bologna to look at the Emilia-Romagna region. Now, this is a region which has been perfecting the practice of collaboration and cooperation since World War II. It went from being one of the poorest regions in Europe to being one of the most prosperous. It's characterized by a very high proportion of small businesses, but what is fascinating about it, and what I believe makes a big difference, is that it has a very strong entrenched culture of dialogue, collaboration, and cooperation across those sectors in society, economy, business, government, that often those are huge barriers. So I took two really great examples from that experience. One was the potential for cooperation in society that can create the kind of space for dialogue, that red space that John's talking about, but also the potential for collaboration within our own very diverse group, where we could draw up our public positions and have an honest conversation about how we can work together to create positive change. The role of the university was so interesting in this context because it convened the dialogue to a large extent. And so that is one example, I think, of how universities can work effectively. I have a number of other examples, and maybe I'll get a chance to talk about them later, in terms of the forestry sector here, in terms of the healthcare debate, and how we look at that in such a narrow way, and also in terms of the whole issue of how we participate in government, in society. I think there could be a very interesting sort of project for a new democracy, which could be convened by the universities. Thank you very much, and I'm sure I took more time than I should have, but I got most of it out.
Thank you so much, Janet. Our next speaker is Chris Kelly, who has been an educator and a leader in that domain for many years, and he's recently stepped down as the superintendent of the school board here in Vancouver. Chris,
Thank
do you want to stay there?
I'm going to be lazy.
Okay.
Hope you don't mind. Thank you, Margot, not only for the introduction, but for the opportunity to be part of this. And John, not only for your presentation, but for all that has led to your presentation from the standpoint of your own conviction, and therefore your professional commitment as well as your social commitment. And Janet, for the context that you've been able to put that into within that brief 10 minutes.
I think it was a long 10 minutes.
It was brief for me. I'm choosing to speak not as a person on behalf of an institution, as you've just been told. I'm in transition, and that is actually the most important frame for what it is that I may have to offer. Not in any dispute at all, pardon me, with what it is John has said, but more from the standpoint of perhaps magnification and some context for what I think we all, both intuitively as well as clearly and actually know, is the importance of what's being articulated here. I don't think you came here to discover this for the first time. My sense is that you came here out of a sense of ready identification and probably quite extensive personal experience, insight and knowledge into essentially what's being said here about a fundamental human responsibility for the sake of common community. So I'm speaking to you as a co-participant of that and a co-citizen within that, with the benefit of some years from that institutional sector in relation to what is now being, I think, so importantly defined by John and others as the core, the heart of a community, the citizen sector, the red zone, however you want to visualize it. I'm within 7 days of completing a career. And as is usually the case, it takes a career to understand a career. From the standpoint of what got you there in the first place and what has sustained you over the course of 33 years, and all of the challenges and disappointments as well as the triumphs of that time. But then most importantly is the question of, so what now? I mean, retirement is a bit of an obsolete term these days, you know. It's actually not a time of retirement, it's a time of graduation and transition into some common sense outside of the institution around, so what is it therefore that this life in relation to other lives actually stands for? And that's a critical point of definition. And frankly, folks, you don't have to wait until the onset of retirement to deal with this. If you're dealing with this on the sort of the regular, even semi-conscious basis that I find that I have been, what you will find you will be doing, and I'm sure you are doing, is defining and redefining the sense of purpose that you can serve in relation to your own assets for the sake of the possibilities of others. There are a couple of things that people in this room have heard me say a number of times, and as long as I'm alive, they're going to hear them, from the standpoint of touchstones for me by way of how you orient yourself in relation to the essentials of what John and others is describing. One of them was a colleague by the name of Peter Grimmett, who said to me and others at some point from his own reflection, he said, you know what happens? He said, when you blend your own sense of moral imperative, whatever that is grounded in, and whatever life experience has brought that to bear in your life, when you ground your own sense of moral imperative with what you know truthfully is your own source of personal fulfillment, however self-focused that may be, your own sense of personal fulfillment, then he said you will have found a true sense of vocation. It's your vocation. It's not your parents' vocation or your friend's vocation or an institution's vocation for you. You have gained your own sense of vocation. And when you gain your own sense of vocation, then unavoidably you begin to engender hope in the lives of others that you interact with, because they have that sense of that natural leadership that you're bringing to your effect on them. Now, that sounds rather universal, but I think it's so important to think about that for each of us individually in relation to the broad challenge that we're wanting to spend some time with this morning around the engagement of community. I would say around their own sense of vocation. And that's why I think it's so important that John, as he has emphasized the importance of focusing on the assets and the capacities of community, as opposed to the needs and the issues and the limitations. Because what he's saying, in effect, is that this is the essential of human empowerment. This is the essential of human learning. That when a teacher, an educator, as an enabler, truly focuses respectfully and wholly on the assets and capacities of the learner herself, and embeds the best that she can in what will be the lived experience of that person, well, then the sky becomes the limit in terms of what that person may make of her life and her possibilities, as opposed to the all surround of the issues and the limitations and the problems that she has to solve. Think of the difference of psychology of that. It's the fundamental of teaching and learning. And what John is effectively saying is, well, now magnify that and extend that out to community. Because there's no difference. It's just a matter of a collective sense of place and purpose and possibility. So what in effect is being said here is that to the extent that each of us, in whatever small way, and then collectively in a more dynamic way, truly and wholly recognizes, steps back, listens, comes to know, and conscientiously responds to what is the reality of the assets and the capacities and therefore the promise of community, the sky becomes the limit for the community on its terms, not on the institution's terms. And therefore, that becomes that interdependent balance, that dynamic balance between the importance of the existence of the institution in relationship to the greatest importance of the capacity and the entitlements of the people within community. Now, that's a dynamic difference. One may say, yeah, that must be the way it is. It's not. Because in our society, in our time, in our history as a culture, our institutions have not actually been established with that sense of how it is they should actually operate in relation to community. because our growth has been different. There has been a displacement of that fundamental, what John would describe as the value of the village, into the mandate of the institution. It wasn't ill-intentioned or mean-intentioned, but it has been evolutionarily so to the point where it has become displaced. And there has to be the conscientious effort, which is what it is that John and others in this room are trying to tap the button on, to change that process back. It's like saying to the parent within the village, saying to the educator within the schoolhouse within the village, if in fact you want to engage the village in raising a child, that can only actually happen in one way. And that is the point at which you truly and wholly and fully and genuinely regard the child as a full person and a co-citizen. Not a citizen in training, not a person in training, not an adult in training to be someday according to the preconditions of the village institutions, but you actually believe that that 5-year-old, within her own capacity to take in and respond to what it is the best you have to offer, is capable of becoming and being the full person that she is. Now that's an attitude shift.
That's important.
Because, you know, the typical point of view has been one of so-called servant work through the institution. But actually there's been a lot of predetermination by the institution for all the right reasons, but in the wrong ways as to what the outcome should be. And then guess what? Whole sectors of society, Aboriginal and others, have turned and said, we can't relate. No, thank you. We can't relate because there's no sense of personal empowerment with that. So we're talking here actually about 3 fundamentals that are essential to you and I actually finding our place in this world and our own sense of meaning within it, extended to the communities that we may choose to make an active difference within. The first one is the sense of belonging. And that the belonging is not condition-laden. It is a sense of belonging that is that active listening and stepping back and welcoming that was being talked about. Along with the belonging is the provision of the greatest sense of competence that we can to the person and to the community on their terms. That's the understanding what their needs are and what they know. And then trusting in the fact that if in fact our sense of the extension of belonging to them in a non-charitable way, in a co-citizen way, and the best competence that we can offer them as a phenomenal institution of university and its faculties with its knowledge and resources, having confidence in the fact that what therefore that neighborhood and that community and that village will therefore self-determine is beyond anything that we can or should presume or imagine. So it's the movement from a sense of benevolent predetermination to respectful self-determination. That's the difference of the point of view. Now, I'm not telling you this for the first time. I know that. And I'm not talking about a wasteland of work not done within the building of community. The extraordinary example of the learning exchange and its growth as opposed to its idleness is full testimony to that. That is an organization that is devoted through this generation of learners within this university and others to truly, respectfully, and I would say compassionately enable the possibilities and capacities of others. And I have seen that in the grade 5 and the grade 4 classrooms. I've seen it. It's absolutely palpable. So, you know, we're onto a good thing here. Everything has to find its time. It can only find its time through the determination of a collective movement, and that's us. You know, there are no more important people out there. There's only us. And that's actually the beauty, but also the challenge of what's being articulated here. So that's all I have to offer, and thank you for the opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much, Chris. I feel a little bit embarrassed in a sense about what's been said about the learning exchange. I didn't ask these folks to give all these wonderful comments, but I really appreciate your partnerships over time, both of you. So our next speaker is Saachi Vikram. Saachi is a third-year sociology student here at UBC, and she's going to tell you a story about her experience working directly in community.
Thank you, Margot. distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Saachi, and I'm a third-year sociology major here at UBC. My involvement with the UBC Learning Exchange began last year when I took a community studies class with Professor Dan Zaberi. And to be honest, at the time, I didn't really know too much about the UBC Learning Exchange or the work that they did in the community. So the Community Service Learning Project that formed part of my community studies class served as my introduction to it. Apparently, a few of my classmates thought they knew more about it than I did, because as I found out later, a fair few number of them had dropped out of the class by the end of the day. I, for one, am glad that I stayed in the class, because it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that my experience with the Community Service Learning Project was by far the most rewarding and educational experience I had last year. We were given the choice between a number of different projects that included a student leadership mentoring program, organizing a math fair, implementing recycling and sustainability programs, and putting on a play. I chose the play. Having been heavily involved in theater in high school, I felt that working with students at Tyee Elementary School to put on this play would fully utilize my talents and interests, and I volunteered to be the leader of our group. The collaboration between the UBC Learning Exchange and my community studies class was a pilot project, so we were forewarned that there would naturally probably be a fair few bumps in the road. The information we had from Tyee at the beginning was rather vague. They wanted our help to put on some sort of play that had something to do with the environment. Everything else was up for interpretation. Now, at the time, we were learning about inner city schools in the US, with problems ranging from poor funding to the influence of gang and street violence on those students, schools, and neighborhoods. The aim of our community service learning project was to take what we learned in class and actually observe it in action at the school we were working with. Tyee Elementary School baffled us initially. Located near Knight Street and Kingsway in the East Side residential neighborhood, Tyee is a district school that draws students from all over Vancouver. Furthermore, Tyee follows a Montessori alternative program whose curriculum and philosophy are unique. With what we were learning in class, we were able to rather neatly identify and label the socioeconomic status of the students in the inner city schools, identify the problems they faced, and what could be done to solve them. However, there were no easy categories into which we could lump the student community at Tyee. While the neighborhood itself is not very prosperous, the students come from all over Vancouver. The school was small and its location good. There were no clearly identifiable socioeconomic groupings, predominantly minority makeup, or a dire lack of funding, like in our readings. Instead, we found other things. Having met the administrators, teachers, and students we were going to be working with, we had noted the enthusiasm and dedication with which they approached the project. We sensed a unique bond between the teachers and students. In the Montessori program, there are children ranging in ages from 1st to 3rd grade, and they work with the same teacher over a number of years. We were struck by how advanced the students seemed and observed the Montessori philosophy at work, which felt very different in comparison to a typical school environment. The community schools coordinator we were working with, Ron, was also invaluable in this process, arranging dates and planning our time with the students and hiring an artist in residence to work with us. In short, we couldn't figure out what was lacking or what was wrong, if anything, so we couldn't figure out how to fix it. This situation unintentionally led to a more positive solution. Since we couldn't figure out what was wrong, the only thing we could do was to work with what we knew and what was right. As a group, we discussed what talents we could each bring to the table. A few of us had experience in theater, others were knowledgeable about the environment and sustainability, others in music, and yet others brought sheer energy to the group. We applied the same approach at the school. We asked the teachers, who knew the children well, to split them into different groups of students who worked well together and assign characters and roles in the play based on their interests and talents. Given the short time we had to put this play together from scratch, our visits to the school were limited to a few Fridays prior to the performance, during which time we wrote a play, got to know the kids, rehearsed it with them, and organized props and costumes. We had a few hairy moments. There were some personality clashes, the student with the lead role feeling that he had a cough the day before the play and wouldn't be able to play the evil littering wizard, and delays and deadlines, but we managed to pull it off and put on a play for the whole community. I learned a lot from this experience, but I think that the most important thing I took away from this whole endeavor is something that I feel is often lacking from the university classroom. We can talk about the problems in the wider world in the classroom forever, without ever fully realizing that these are real people we're talking about. That the heroes that we read about in class, the teachers who inspire and make a difference in the bleakest inner city schools, and administrators who do their best with the funding and resources available to them, really do exist right here in Vancouver, and they're out there working every day. And the children whose lives they make a difference in every day are very real as well. No amount of theorizing in class could make up for the concrete action in the wider world. And it's not always about finding a big solution to a big problem, but working with the resources and people around you to make something wonderful, however little, happen. Our play may not have changed the amount of arts funding available to schools in Vancouver, but we nevertheless put on a play with different acts and costumes and props and characters. And we all knew it was a success because moments after the final performance, the kids crowded around us and wanted to know, when are we going to do this again? I know that everyone in my group felt a great sense of accomplishment at the end of this project, and owe a thanks to the people who made this possible. The UBC Learning Exchange, Susan Grossman, Dan Zuberry, and last but not least, the wonderful staff and students of Tyee Elementary School. Thank you.
Thank you, Saachi. So I thought we would now take a couple of minutes for you to turn to someone who's sitting close by and have a bit of a conversation with your colleagues about what you've heard this morning. We've heard some amazing perspectives, questions, challenges, contradictions, conundrums. So if you can turn to someone close to you and take a few minutes to just talk about what you've learned, what questions are coming up for you, maybe some new learnings, some surprises, and then we'll have some time for questions to the speakers later on. So take a few minutes to just talk to each other for a second.
Sure.
Thank you for engaging in your conversations with each other. I want to give everybody a chance to also ask questions of our speakers. So if we can turn to that portion of the program this morning. There's obviously some great questions being raised in the room, and so I'd like to open the floor for any questions from the audience to any of the speakers. And I'll let you guys organize yourselves from this point on, okay? So, and we've got a mic, I think, somewhere. Chris has got a mic. Yeah, Dan.
Hi, Margaret. Do I need to use the mic? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, for the recording, using the mic would be helpful, yeah.
The time frame. Heard you speak about neighborhood and community, and where do you go to define community? What is it? You say, where do you go to get something done, or where in your community to go? I want to know how we reconcile or interface this now with sort of a wider community that's brought to us by technology and by the mobility that we have. I think it's an important question. We're talking about community and neighborhood. How do we sort of redefine or take a look at this now? Because when we want stuff now, we go across the internet, which is global. We drive across the city to a specialized store, this type of thing, and I think you know where I'm going with that. So if we could sort of, I've got another one later, but I'll ask the second question later. Thank you.
As the oldest person sitting here, I know least about what you're talking to me about. Saachi may be able to. That's right. And I don't really. Our focus has been on small places. And so your question is larger than a small place in one sense. But we have been interested in how the internet, for instance, might be used as something that abets local neighborhood organizations. And there are a fair number of examples that we have of that kind of thing. A neighborhood that lets everybody know if anybody is sick, for instance. Lets everybody know whose birthday it is. Very personal keying of information to relationships, right? Another thing that I think we've seen is that the idea is very attractive and it starts off with enthusiasm and it fades away pretty quickly. I don't know why, but to look at a neighborhood communication approach through the internet that has some continuity in life through time doesn't seem to us to happen too often. That it's attractive at the beginning, but then not so attractive. I don't say not so attractive, it just doesn't get used, looked at as time passes. So that's a very micro response. But we'll let people here who have more ideas.
Saachi probably has ideas.
I'm actually pretty interested in online communities and interactions that take place via the internet. And one of the things that one of the things that came up in some of the readings that I've done is that there's no accountability online. You're free to engage with and leave a community with with a lot of ease. So there's no sense that you need to keep on participating or stay engaged. So I think that from some of the readings that I've done at least is one of the things that probably might explain why that sort of engagement doesn't last for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could make a comment on that, maybe I'll try this one. I could make a comment on that too. I think, there's a lot of discussion right now about the reorganization of our economy, and moving to this new normal and how we shape the kind of society that we want. And I think very often, I've heard a lot of people say, we don't really need to worry about that because we have such a strong creative class and such a strong focus on new media. Now, that always worries me a little bit, and it's not that I'm a Luddite. I actually maybe am a bit of a Luddite, but I think that we tend to, it's very easy to look at technology as the solution, whereas really what technology is enabling, It's a tool. It's a tool the same way the telephone is a tool. And so I think we need to be careful and deliberate and try to understand how we employ those tools in the context, to help us make good decisions within the community. And I just to go back to the example that I raised of Bologna, it is such an interesting example because as a society and an economy, it has become very nimble, adaptable, and very well able to survive and to thrive despite the restructuring of supply chains forced by globalization. And it is a community which keeps the wealth in that community. So I think we need to move beyond just the simple idea of technology as a solution to look at, how different institutions or different sectors in our economy and society relate in order to create that strength. So,
I see.
Can I just add some emphasis to the importance of a response to your question, Dan, that has been, it is what we determine to be, or we are determined by it. And I know that's pretty straightforward, but it's a discipline as opposed to a hoped-for state that won't actually generate itself. I remember years and years ago when we were asking the question of what will be the effects of the onset of technology. There was a fellow by the name of Norman Gold who worked with the World Education Association who said simply, if we decide to determine what is humane about technology as opposed to allowing technology to predetermine what is humane about us, then we'll be in an okay place. But he despaired over that. And as I think about it quickly, and I am probably the last to talk with any knowledge of the real activity or utility of technology. It was as recently as yesterday as I was trying to understand, along with my son at my side as my guide and coach, what is it that drives Google? Like, what is the mind within Google, and what's its intentionality, and what is it actually doing to, because I was quite dependent on it at that point in terms of some information that I needed. He told me a story actually about the corporation itself and its own, as a corporation, its own sense of responsibility. And that was reassuring for me. Well, that's a very macro example. I'm bringing it down now to the same topic that we're talking about, and that is that there is a resourcefulness in our hands, I would assume, within a university or any other institution, in order to enable a community of people to determine what it is that would be, humane and necessary and possible about technology and all of its capacities, where this same theme is concerned. But if we don't do that conscientiously, then I think it'll be determined externally, and that's what your question strikes at. How do we go about adding that to our determinations? Very important one.
Okay. As long as we're at a university interested in intellectual issues, let me raise another question. I was trying to raise a question here of the limits of institutional production of our well-being and domains of community for that so-called production. I think it may be useful to think the same way about things run by electricity. Okay? What are the limits of what you can do with electricity? And in a way, your question raises that in my mind. One of my best friends and colleagues and helpers over the years was a great intellectual named Ivan Illich. And Illich, at one time as the internet was beginning to come forward, had questions about the new communities it's creating. And he said to me, "How do you know whether a person is dead?" So the way you know is, some people say, because their heart's not beating. He says, but there's another way of knowing, and that is their senses are useless. They can't personally taste, touch, smell, hear, feel. He says, and that's the limit of electricity. Electricity may be useful for information, but the key to care and human relationships is, can I hear you, see you, touch you, smell you? Then I could love you, really. And then we would have a community. So I don't think there's any possibility of any electrical system ever replacing the value of our direct use of our senses. And that's why getting students out of universities and into community settings where their senses, rather than information, can also inform them. Okay?
Thank you. This has been really quite amazing morning. I just want to ask John, and I guess anyone else who wanted to comment about what happens when communities sometimes engage in ways that are not actually the best for their own interests. I think everybody's heard of Not in Our Backyard. In Vancouver, we also have something called Not in Anybody's Backyard. So I just wanted you to sort of comment on that, and also how do you think universities could possibly engage in that process of getting people to sort of reflect on what is in their best interests? So.
That's a wonderful thought. I think the sociologists tell us, we once spent a day trying to get a definition, a workable definition for community from the sociology department at Northwestern University. Are there any sociologists here? That was a fruitless activity. Because there not only was not agreement, but there was always so abstract that you couldn't use it. But one person said, something that everybody else then agreed to. He said a community is the name for a group of people who have a common agreed affinity, and in recognizing that affinity, create outsiders. Right? There is no community that has not created outsiders. Without any intention, I do that. I belong to the Cook County Association of Norwegian elk hound owners. And I hate to tell you, but Labrador Retriever people are, without our intention, just not really welcome. Right? So, this question of exclusion, I think you're raising, is true of all of us every time we draw a boundary and call it a community together. How do we deal with that reality? There's a good friend in Toronto, sort of the leader of the inclusion movement in North America, named Judith Snow, who, when we were discussing this, said the task of people who are real citizens is to make sure that there's always a welcome at the edge. That the question is hospitality. How can we be hospitable? Right? And that maybe a university, I have great belief in the universities convening. We have a Neighborhood Innovations Forum that we convene neighborhood organization leaders every other month, in which we bring some innovative neighborhood initiative from some place for them to hear about, right? And one of the things we have tried to do is to also bring groups that are expansive and are hospitable. So how can you promote hospitality? Not, the American universities, they have departments of hospitality, which are really how to run a hotel. But where are the experts here on hospitality? And maybe that's a very important thing. What leads to hospitality? Where are hospitable and diverse local communities? Where are places where inhospitable places became hospitable? And why was that? There would be, I think, a great field of study.
Can I give a practical answer? Oh, sure. Based on, having just been through a process which unfolded over a pretty extensive period of time regarding a NIMBY response to a housing project for single mothers we were building out in Coquitlam, actually. Now, YWCA is pretty inoffensive, I think, right? So we have single mothers, and we get, absolutely outstanding results. We know that the women who come, when they come to live with our organization initially, most of them are on income assistance or welfare, more than 80%. Within a 5-year period of time, that statistic reverses. They then transition out and they are employed in jobs. Well, last month we had 2 graduate as nurses. One, a teacher, went to take a teaching job in Calgary. One finished a master's degree in sociology, actually. So, pretty inoffensive. Nonetheless, we had a very strong negative response, primarily from organized community organizations within that community. And we had a split council. We'd asked council to give us land at nominal value, and we'd worked, and this was something they said they wanted to do through their affordable housing plan and policy. But when we came to them to say, okay, where's the piece of land? It took us 3 runs really to fix on a piece of land that was acceptable, and initially had a split council. And we moved from that to a position where it was embraced fully by all members of council, proudly. And pretty broadly embraced in the community. And so what made the difference for us? I have to say, we connected with the most amazing network of organized groups. There were a lot of faith-based groups, quite frankly, variety. It wasn't one particular denomination. And it wasn't because they viewed the YWCA as a Christian organization, because really for the past 50 years, we've officially been inclusive of all faiths and cultures. But they got behind us, and they felt this is really something that's needed in this community. When we went to our public hearing, this network of organizations, we had like 250 people out to speak in favor of it. And there were a few representatives from the organizations that had opposed it. So it was all the classic arguments about, you know, this is a great thing, but just this is a bad location, all of the classic stuff. But it was that network of organizations that worked with us very successfully to turn that around. So now, that doesn't answer the role of the university, and I'm sorry, but in terms of how the university could participate, I'm thinking again about the frontline example of Margot's work. I mean, things like this would be a really wonderful opportunity, I think, to engage students to learn about that dynamic in community and about what I think John very nicely framed as the whole idea of hospitality and welcoming in.
If I may, just within all of that, I would also suggest that universities are already so good at this, but may become that much more conscientious in asking critical questions, not in an academic way, and not in a detached or presumed to be authoritative way, but in a genuinely concerned way of the committee, of the community, respectfully. But they would be questions of fundamental value, and they would be ethically based questions. I don't mean in a condescending way. I mean in a way that was conscientiously put, recognizing that in any such issue where a community of people or communities of people have arrived at a practice or a decision or a resolve that's not actually in the best interests of the whole, there's a dilemma. That there's not a simple black and white. There's a dilemma that's at the core of that, and an informed source of sort of pegging the dilemma, asking the critical questions, and then playing the critical role of facilitating or generating the response, whatever the issue may be, in whatever context, environmentally, socially, culturally, whatever it is. I think the university is beautifully located to do that, and already does. I believe it already does. When I think of the way in which faculty and individuals will locate themselves within some of the greatest issues, and not presume to hold the answers, but to ask the critical questions, that's a critical role already underway, I think.
Can I add one thing to what Janet was saying? On the map, the red space has the associational domain. And I hear you saying that just as there's a diversity of opinion among individuals, there's a diversity of opinion at the associational level. In a way, you were reaching to those associations that would be in support of your particular goals. And I think that tactically is absolutely right, and that for people interested in change, understanding the topography of the associational world at the local level is the bottom line. You aren't going to change anything without knowing that. And if you go to our website, which is abcdinstitute.org, we have a couple of guides to mapping local neighborhood associations that might be of help. The most useful one is called New Tools for Child Health, because it was done for the American Academy of Pediatricians, who wanted to know how could we connect with the associational world in neighborhoods around the health of children, right?
We've got time for one more quick question.
Hi, I don't know how many UBC students are here, but as a student in university in the business faculty, so I'm probably going to go into the corporate society, but you have an interest for community learning and engagement. So in the sense that I want to be part of the black circle, like the black circle and the red circle as well, but thinking as I leave school, I probably want a job that pays, but yet be involved. So the whole dilemma of, where with my passion, where do I go? And I feel that most of like these might have conflicting interests, because if you're being paid to do something, might be detached from it, but yet if you go without being paid, then you can't live, in a sense. So how do you answer?
Absolutely. Well, I've been thinking a lot about that this morning, and that's actually one of the reasons I kind of diverted from how I was actually going to prepare my comments to talk a bit about our work at Crabtree Corner. And a point that I didn't make very effectively was those women that I talked about who'd come through our programs, developed skills, acquired knowledge, and then became our employees. It's really for the first time in their lives. They've had jobs. They've had independence. They've been able to contribute to their communities as they define them. And so this whole idea of, obviously employment is fundamental to independence. We all need to work, and we need to make our economy function as well. What's been interesting to me about the work that we've been doing with the Human Early Learning Partnership is looking at how that balance is set. Because when you look at what's happening in our society, people are working longer and longer hours. There's more pressure on people to, I can't remember the stats, but it's something like the average couple is working like 30 more hours annually, I can't remember, but it's significant. And so what that does is it constrains people's ability to care effectively for their children, their families, their elderly parents, and to contribute as volunteers. And ultimately, that's not healthy for society. So I think we need to engage in a discussion in our society about where we actually set that balance and look at that whole issue of work-life balance. This is a particularly important issue for women, because women now comprise 50% of the paid labor force, yet are still managing the lion's share of domestic responsibility and care responsibilities for children and elderly relatives. And so there's a double bind there. So I would argue that we need to look seriously at public policy incentives to increase the space for people to participate in John's red zone. So one example might be this whole idea of parental leave. One of the things we know is important is creating space for men to care for children, to equalize that balance between men and women. So if we seriously in our society looked at things like maybe a proportion of parental leave reserved exclusively for men, you would change the paradigm in society. More men would actually exercise it, and you'd remove some of the gender bias in hiring decisions in the workplace. So I think that we need to push the discussion forward to what does that actually mean for the decisions we make at a public policy level in order to create that space. Okay.
Thank you, Janet. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we said this event would end at 11:30, which it now is. So I hate to cut the discussion off. There's been some amazing, as Penny said, there are amazing comments coming from the panelists, the speakers, and great questions coming from the audience. I think it's clear that it's been indicated that our role as a university is to convene this kind of dialogue. Hopefully this will be one in a series of ongoing dialogues about these kinds of really important issues. So I want to thank all of our speakers for their incredibly insightful, thoughtful, challenging remarks this morning. I've got little presents for everybody, so I'll give those out on behalf of all of us. But I really hope you will join me in thanking our speakers from the bottom of it.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for coming as well. And I want to thank Sandra Singh and the staff of the Ike Barber Learning Center for co-hosting this event with us, and to thank the Learning Exchange staff, Chris Cook and Lily Dew in particular, for helping to organize the event this morning. Thank you.